Hey class, this is Professor Pronte, and here's your video for this particular module. So the title here is Industrial Expansion and Concentration. And as you can see on the board behind me here, the period of time that we're going to look at are the 1860s roughly to around 1914. There's a lot happening during these years, and so I'm going to try to sort of organize the main themes and ideas that we're after here. One of the things that really stands out about this period of time is that the American economy was going through a big transition in terms of what they were making. Let's stand up. Right, so at this time, 1860s, the leading sector for the United States economy overall was agriculture, right? Lots of farming. And it was still a big deal in the years afterwards, but it was during these years we were first starting to see this transition away from farming being the leading industry towards industry and things being produced in factories as being the most important thing in our economy. So as this transition then took place, one big punchline that we saw, one big theme from this chapter, is that we ended up seeing markets being more concentrated. Right? So what does that mean? Markets are concentrated when there's a smaller number of businesses that are dominating the industry. Right? So you can have a market look a couple of different ways. You can have a market where there's lots and lots of firms competing, and each of them have a small share of the overall market. Right? That would be an unconcentrated market. Or you could see a situation where there are fewer firms. Right? A couple of big players, they're dominating things. Right? That would be a market that's highly concentrated. And so what we saw then in these years is that markets were moving towards being more concentrated. There were a couple of factors here that contributed to this concentration that we were seeing throughout the economy. One was that it was during these years where we saw firms starting to take advantage of mass production. The idea that there are efficiencies to be had if you're producing things on a much larger scale. This is a really intuitive idea. I bet you guys have this sense already that there's advantages from this. A famous example of a company that has been able to take advantage of mass production is Ford, right? Car maker. Henry Ford is one of the people most well known with taking advantage of these assembly lines, where instead of having cars being produced in a situation where one worker would put together all the different parts on a car, instead he realized, and others realized, that a more cost-effective way to do this would be to move the car along the assembly line and have one worker just repeat the same task over and over again on all the cars that pass through. So this is called by your textbook continuous flow production. We saw this with Ford, as well as other factory owners at the time. Mass production then should be thought of as one area by which firms can take advantage of economies of scale. This is a big idea to know about. Economies of scale simply mean that a firm can produce more cheaply. Their average cost of production is going to fall if they're producing on a larger scale. Right? It's more effective to make 1 million units than to produce just one. This can come from firms being able to buy their inputs at lower prices. So a huge company like Costco, for instance, can put pressure on their suppliers and buy those products at a lower price than a smaller retailer might be able to. Right? So by taking advantage of their position in the market, they can buy inputs at lower prices. That's one reason for economies of scale. You can also see economies of scale because of greater use of specialization. When you're producing on a really big scale, it becomes more viable. Right? You have greater opportunities to use workers and machinery that are more focused and therefore more productive. So we saw economies of scale then at this time being used broadly, and this contributed to the concentration of firms in these years because bigger firms had an advantage. Right? If you're a big firm who's making more, producing more than your smaller competitors, you're going to have lower costs, and you can drive those firms out of business. Right? So economies of scale contributed to markets becoming more concentrated. Another factor that contributed to markets becoming more concentrated was the development of financial markets. Right, so financial markets occur when there are people, we're just talking about money being exchanged in a market here. Largely here I'm talking about the banking industry that was becoming a bigger deal in the late 1800s. J.P. Morgan is a big name from this industry at this time. As financial markets developed, it gave firms a better opportunity. They had an easier time acquiring money, borrowing money, and therefore expanding and taking advantage of economies of scale. Right? And so this further contributed to concentration in the sense that it made it easier for firms to expand. These first elements here, mass production, economies of scale, the development of financial markets, right? These are reasons why we're seeing concentration that aren't associated with any sort of illegal behavior or maybe even immoral behavior or anything like that. There were other steps that were being taken, activities that we saw that contributed to more concentration that maybe were illegal and were maybe immoral. We're talking about pooling arrangements and trusts. So the idea here is that firms sometimes have an advantage to team up with one another, right? Make an agreement to not compete and instead to coordinate their actions. Pooling and trusts are ways that firms can do this. Under pooling, what will take place is that firms will agree to split up a market, right? They can split it up according to geography or by sales or by a number of different factors. Right? They split up the market and then funnel all sales or all profits into this joint pot or pool. And then afterwards, they divide up that pot. The idea is that by trying to maximize the total profits in that pool, there's going to be more profits for them to split at the end than they would instead competing against one another. Right? So this is something that's good news, I guess, if you're a firm that's able to do it. But that's bad news for consumers. Trusts are somewhat similar. Right? With the trust, what takes place is that firms will coordinate their management decisions by having one person, right, or one group of people make decisions for all the people underneath that trust. Right? So for instance, if McDonald's and Burger King, right, two companies today that compete against one another, if they were to form a trust, what that would mean is that they would identify a small group of people, right, who are then going to make decisions for the both of them. And so they could price their products similarly. They could market their products similarly. They could coordinate with one another in terms of deciding where they're going to locate various restaurants. Right? There's one person making decisions for all the firms underneath that are members of this trust. And by doing so, we see less competition. All right, so the big punchline then that we're seeing here is that for all of these reasons, the markets are becoming less competitive. We're seeing less competition in the American economy, and instead, a smaller number of real big firms dominating things. That's bad. So what to do about it? We saw a couple of new laws, new legislation, new pieces of legislation put into place to sort of push back against this. One is the Sherman Act. And what the Sherman Act sought to do was to make monopolies illegal. Another piece of antitrust legislation that's famous that you ought to know about is called the Clayton Act. This is much later. This was in 1914. Clayton Act did a variety of things. One thing that it did is it established something called the FTC. It's the Federal Trade Commission. They're tasked with looking at mergers and deciding if a merger should go ahead because there is enough competition or should be stopped because there's not enough competition. The Clayton Act made it illegal for firms for people on the board of directors of firms to have interlocking directorates. Right? So what that means is that the board of directors at one company and another would have a whole lot of carryover, crossover between the two. So really there's just one group of people managing both firms. Clayton Act did things like make it illegal to purchase stock in your competitor's firm. All sorts of specific behaviors associated with less competition were made illegal because of the Clayton Act. All right. So there you go, guys. The punchline again is we're seeing less competition in the late 1800s. Right? Markets becoming more concentrated. And you can see some of the reasons why, as well as the response from the federal government in terms of antitrust legislation.